The telegram was already in her hands when she realized what it said. Louise Cooper stood at the narrow wooden counter of the Harlan Creek Telegraph Station, the late August heat pressing down on the building like a fist, and she read the words a second time because the first time had not been enough to make her believe them. The paper was thin and yellowed at the edges, the ink still fresh from the operator's careful hand, and every word on it was designed to ruin her. To Roscoe BRENNER stop Cooper land deal terminated stop you will honor prior agreement with SUTTON holding stop partnership. With Cooper woman dissolved effective immediately stop funds to be redirected stop do not proceed stop SIGNED ALDOUS SUTTON. She read it a third time. Her breath came slow and even, which surprised her, because inside her chest something was already cracking open like drought-dried clay after the first rain. She had trusted Roscoe Brenner with everything. The water rights to the eastern tributary, the deed to the southern 40 acres her father had left in her name, the promise she had made at her father's grave that she would save Cooper Ranch from the men who wanted to carve it apart. And now Aldous Sutton, that smooth-faced snake from Denver with his silver watch chain and his letters of credit, had sent a telegram intended to reach Roscoe Brenner before she could. The telegraph operator, a young man barely 20 named Clem, was watching her from beneath his green visor with the nervous expression of someone who had just realized he had handed the wrong letter to the wrong person. "Ma'am," he said, "that telegram is addressed to. I know who it's addressed to." Louise set the paper flat on the counter and looked at it with the concentrated stillness of a woman making a decision that would change everything. "Get me a fresh sheet." Clem blinked. "Ma'am, a fresh sheet of paper, Clem, and your pen." The world outside the station was the dry, golden world of Nevada Territory in 1882, where the summer sun hammered the earth into submission and the sagebrush bent low to escape it. Somewhere out there, Roscoe Brenner was riding toward Harlan Creek on his roan horse, expecting to receive this telegram, expecting to be given instructions that would, without him knowing it, destroy everything between them. Louise picked up the pen. She was going to rewrite the terms. She had been building toward this moment for 6 months, though she had not known it at the time, and to understand why she stood in that telegraph station rewriting another man's betrayal, you had to understand how she and Roscoe Brenner had come to stand on opposite sides of the same desperate dream. It had begun in February, when the ground was still frozen, and the sky above Nevada Territory was a pale, cold blue that offered no comfort to anyone. Louise Cooper was 27 years old in February of 1882, and she had been running Cooper Ranch alone for nearly 2 years. Her father, Daniel Cooper, had died of a lung fever in the spring of 1880, leaving her with 400 acres of prime Nevada range land, a substantial debt to the Harlan Creek Territorial Bank, and a foreman named Gil Stokes who was loyal but aging, and whose knees gave him trouble in the cold. The ranch had once been prosperous. Her father had built it up over 15 years with nothing more than stubbornness and a good eye for cattle. But the winter of 1879 had killed a significant portion of their herd, and the costs of rebuilding had forced her father to borrow against the land. When he died, the debt came to Louise, and the bank's patience was not unlimited. The problem, beyond the debt, was water. Cooper Ranch sat on the eastern edge of a basin that in good years was well watered by the creek system that ran down from the mountains. But a larger operation, the Sutton Holdings Range that had been established 3 years prior by Aldous Sutton of Denver, had been diverting water from the northern tributary in ways that were arguably legal and certainly devastating. The creek that had once reliably watered the Cooper southern pastures ran half its previous volume now, and in summer it ran less than that. Louise had spent the better part of 2 years writing letters and making the 6-hour ride to Carson City and speaking to territorial officials and land agents and anyone else who might listen. She had been heard politely and helped not at all. Then she had heard about Roscoe Brenner. He was not from Nevada. He was from Texas originally, a place called Comfort in the Hill Country, and he had come to Nevada Territory the previous autumn with a reputation as a man who knew water law and land rights the way other men knew card hands, which was to say intimately and profitably. He had a small operation of his own about 30 miles north of Harlan Creek, a modest ranch with good horses and a well that never ran dry, and he had a habit of getting things done through legal channels that other men had given up on. The story that circulated about him in Harlan Creek was that he had successfully contested a water rights claim in Texas 3 years prior, forcing a large cattle operation to restore access to a shared creek that they had dammed without authorization. The smaller ranchers downstream had been saved. Roscoe Brenner had done it through a combination of careful documentation, territorial law, and a bulldog stubbornness that apparently no amount of intimidation had been able to shake. Louise had heard this story and thought, quietly and without telling anyone, that she needed to meet this man. She had ridden out to his ranch on a cold February morning, with the wind cutting across the basin and her breath making small clouds in the air. She had expected, because she had constructed him as a legend in her mind, something large and certain. Instead, she found a man of medium height with brown hair and thoughtful dark eyes who was standing in his corral trying to convince a stubborn mare to accept a new bridle. He had looked up when she rode in, assessed her with a directness that was not rude but was not shy either, and said, "You look like someone with a problem." "I have several," Louise said. "May I step down, please?" She stepped down from her horse and told him about Cooper Ranch and the water and Aldous Sutton. She told him about the debt and the bank and the southern pastures. She spoke for 20 minutes without stopping, standing in his cold corral with the wind in her hair, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "The eastern tributary is the key. If you can establish prior appropriation rights on the eastern tributary before Sutton files an extension claim, you can legally compel him to restore the northern flow. Can that be done? If someone does it soon, yes." He looked at her with those thoughtful dark eyes. "What are you proposing?" "A partnership," Louise said. "You know the legal mechanisms. I have the documentation going back to my father's original claim. Between us, we can build a case." "And what do I get from this partnership?" She had thought about this. "Grazing rights on the southern 40 acres through the end of next year, and a percentage of the revenue from the eastern pasture once the water issue is resolved. I can't offer cash I don't have, but I can offer what the land produces." He had looked at her for a long time after that, and she had held his gaze because she had learned that looking away in negotiations was a form of conceding ground. "All right," he said finally. "Let's talk terms." They had stood in that cold corral for another hour working out the details, and by the time she rode back toward Harlan Creek, the sun was already lowering and she felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she might actually have a chance. What she had not expected was that the partnership would be the most complicated and consuming thing that had ever happened to her, not because of the legal difficulties, which were considerable, but because of Roscoe Brenner himself. He was a private man, which she respected, because she was private too. He did not talk about himself unnecessarily. He worked with a focused, methodical energy that she recognized in herself, and he was good at the work in a way that was quietly evident rather than loudly announced. When he rode out to Cooper Ranch for the first time to look at the eastern tributary, he said almost nothing for the first 2 hours, just walked the creek bed and examined the ground and made notes in a small leather-covered book. Then he sat down on a flat rock at the bend in the creek and said, "Your father filed this claim in 1868. "Yes. And the original survey puts the eastern boundary right here at the cedar trees. That's what the paperwork says. Then you have prior appropriation on this tributary going back 14 years, and Sutton's filing is from 1879. You have precedence." He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. "This is winnable, Louise." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she was aware of it in a way she did not want to examine too closely. Over the following weeks they worked together with a regularity that became, almost without her noticing, the organizing principle of her days. He would ride over on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or she would ride to his place, and they would go through documents and survey records and the back copies of the Nevada territorial statutes that he had obtained from Carson City. He had a careful, precise mind that did not make emotional arguments, which she admired. He also had a dry, spare humor that occasionally surfaced at unexpected moments and made her laugh before she had time to prepare for it. There was an afternoon in March when they were working through a particularly dense section of water law by the light of her father's old oil lamp, and she made a comment about the impenetrability of legal language, and he looked up from the papers and said, perfectly seriously, "My theory is that lawyers write this way specifically to ensure that no one can read it without a lawyer, which is more or less the whole business model." And she had laughed, genuinely and without thinking, and the sound of her own laughter had surprised her because she had not heard it much in 2 years. He looked at her when she laughed, and there was something in his expression that she stored away without examining. There were things she noticed about him that she also stored away. That he always brought coffee when he came to her ranch, because he had observed that she ran out of it and did not always have time to get to town. That he was unfailingly courteous to Gil Stokes and to the 2 ranch hands, treating them with a respect that was not performative. That when she was upset, which happened on the harder days when the legal process seemed to be moving like cold molasses, he did not offer false reassurance. He would simply lay out the specific next step and say, "This is the thing we do next," and somehow that was more comforting than any comfort would have been. She was also aware, in the way one becomes aware of a slow fire, that he was watching her, not intrusively, not in the way that some men watched women, with a proprietary assessment that she had always found insulting. He watched her the way you watch something you are trying to understand completely, with attention and a kind of careful respect. She did not say anything about it. He did not say anything about it either. Aldous Sutton entered their lives directly in April, though he had been the background threat all along. He rode into Cooper Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon without invitation, which immediately told Louise everything she needed to know about what kind of man he was. He was maybe 50, with the well-fed, carefully composed look of someone who had spent decades making other people uncomfortable while maintaining his own comfort absolutely. He wore a gray suit that had no business being in Nevada territory, and he had a young man with him who was clearly an employee of some variety, carrying a leather satchel. Louise met him on the porch. "Miss Cooper," Sutton said pleasantly, "I've been hoping we could have a conversation." "You might have sent a message first," Louise said. "It's generally how conversations are arranged." His smile did not waver. "I apologize for the informality. I'm a direct man. I find that direct visits lead to more productive conversations than letters." He looked around the ranch yard with the measuring gaze of someone calculating value. "Beautiful place. Your father built something significant here." "He did. What do you want, Mr. Sutton?" He came directly to it then, which she gave him credit for. He wanted to buy Cooper Ranch. "Not all of it," he said generously. "Just the southern 40 acres and the water rights to the eastern tributary." He named a figure that was not insulting but was well below what those assets were worth, particularly if the water rights dispute was resolved in her favor. "I'm not selling," Louise said. "You have a significant debt obligation to the Harlan Creek Bank," Sutton said. "I want to be helpful, not adversarial. The debt is my business." "Of course." He looked at her with eyes that were pleasant on the surface and cold underneath. "I understand you've entered into some kind of arrangement with Roscoe Brenner. He's a clever man. But I want to be honest with you, Miss Cooper, because I respect directness. Mr. Brenner has his own interests to consider. Men in his position often find that the practical path leads to accommodation rather than conflict." Louise looked at him steadily. "Thank you for your visit, Mr. Sutton. Good day." He left, and Louise stood on the porch watching his wagon roll out of the yard, and she felt the first cold breath of something she could not yet name. She told Roscoe about the visit the next Thursday when he came with the coffee and a new brief he had been drafting for the Territorial Land Office. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "He'll try again," Roscoe said, "and he won't just work on you." "He mentioned you," Louise said. "He said men in your position often find practical accommodations." Roscoe's expression shifted subtly. "He's saying he'll approach me directly." "Yes." He looked at her, and for a moment something passed between them that was not about water rights at all. "I want you to know something, Louise. Whatever approach he makes to me, it won't change the direction of this work. I gave my word on the terms of our partnership, and I intend to honor it." She believed him. She believed him completely and without reservation, and this was, in retrospect, what made the telegram hurt as badly as it did. Sutton did approach Roscoe. In May, Roscoe mentioned it briefly, almost in passing, saying that he had received a letter from Sutton Holdings with what was described as a business proposal, and that he had not responded to it. Louise nodded and moved on to the next item of business, because she trusted him, and because she did not want to hover over him like a suspicious creditor checking accounts. The Territorial Land Office case was progressing. By June, they had submitted the prior appropriation documentation, the original survey records, and a careful legal brief that Roscoe had assembled over 4 months of meticulous work. The hearing was scheduled for September. If they won the hearing, Louise would have legally enforceable water rights to the eastern tributary, which would in turn give her leverage to compel the restoration of the northern flow and save the ranch. If they lost, or if something disrupted the process before September, Louise was not sure she could hold on. The summer heat arrived and compressed everything. The creek ran lower than she had ever seen it. 3 of her cattle died in July from heat and dehydration, and she spent 2 days riding the range in temperatures that pressed down like a hot iron, trying to find supplemental water sources and failing to find enough of them. She was exhausted in a way that went down to the bone. Roscoe rode over one evening in late July and found her sitting on the porch steps, her hat on the step beside her and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, staring at nothing in particular. He unsaddled his horse at the rail and came and sat on the step below hers without saying anything, and they sat in the cooling evening air for a while before he spoke. "The hearing is 6 weeks away," he said. "The case is strong." "I know." She looked at the horizon where the sky was going from gold to deep orange. "I'm tired, Roscoe. I know. Not just physically. I mean," she stopped and searched for the right words. "This ranch is everything my father built. The debt, the water, Sutton trying to squeeze from every direction. Some days I don't know if I'm fighting for the ranch or if I've just become so used to fighting that I've forgotten to ask myself why." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know why. Tell me." "Because it's yours, because your father trusted you with it, and because you're not the kind of woman who walks away from a thing she's decided to do." He paused. "Those are good enough reasons." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and the evening light was doing something to his face that made it impossible not to notice that he was a man she had come to rely on in ways that exceeded the practical arrangement they had made. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them that she recognized because she felt it too, this careful, compressed feeling that neither of them had addressed. "Why did you agree to this partnership?" she asked. "Truly. You had your own ranch, your own work. You could have said no." He considered this for a long moment, and she liked that about him, that he did not answer quickly when the honest answer required thought. "Because what Sutton is doing is wrong," he said, "and because the law can stop it if someone uses it right. Those were the practical reasons." He looked at her steadily. "And because you rode out to my ranch on a cold morning and laid out your case with complete clarity and not a single appeal to sentiment, and I thought that was remarkable. Those were the other reasons." Louise felt the warmth of that move through her like the first genuinely warm day after a long winter. "Roscoe," she said, and then stopped because she was not entirely sure what she intended to say next. "I know," he said very quietly. "There's time for that after September." She understood what he meant. They both understood that the hearing, the case, the ranch, all of it needed to come first. That allowing the other thing to surface before the work was done would complicate everything and risk everything. She was grateful to him for naming it that way, for giving it a shape and a timeline without pressure. After September, she agreed. He stayed for supper that night, and they talked about other things, easier things, stories about Texas and stories about her father and the early days of the ranch, and it was the most comfortable evening she had passed in a long time. August arrived and the case was on track. Roscoe was traveling more frequently to Carson City, and she was managing the ranch with Gil and the hands, and the days had a forward momentum that felt almost like hope. It was in the second week of August that she became aware that something had changed. She noticed it first in small ways. Roscoe was slightly more distracted on his visits. The conversations were focused tightly on the case, with less of the easy back and forth they had developed over months. He was not cold exactly, but there was a careful distance in him that had not been there in July. She told herself it was the pressure of the upcoming hearing. She told herself it was the heat. She told herself a variety of things that were plausible and convenient. On the 17th of August, she rode into Harlan Creek to collect the mail and purchase supplies and check in with the bank about the upcoming payment schedule. She collected the mail from the post office without incident, and then she happened to walk past the telegraph station on her way back to the Mercantile, and Clem, who was not very experienced and had always been slightly intimidated by Louise, called out to her from the doorway. "Miss Cooper, ma'am, there's a telegram here for." He stopped. "That is, there's a telegram that just came in. For me." "Well, no, ma'am. It's addressed to." He held it out, and Louise, acting on pure instinct, took it from his hand before he finished his sentence. She read the name on the outside, Roscoe Brenner. She looked at Clem. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who was not certain what had just happened. "I'll see that he gets it," she said, which was not technically a lie, and she walked away from the telegraph station before Clem could think of anything to say. She read it in the gap between the hardware store and the feed merchant, standing in the narrow strip of shade, with the heat coming off the packed earth around her. To Roscoe, BRENNER stop, Cooper land deal terminated stop you, will honor prior agreement with SUTTON holding stop partnership. With Cooper woman dissolved effective immediately stop funds to be redirected stop, do not proceed stop, SIGNED. ALDOUS SUTTON. She stood very still for a long time. There were several things this telegram could mean, and she sorted through them with the systematic clarity that she had always used to manage the harder moments of her life. It could mean that Roscoe had secretly agreed to work for Sutton, in which case the partnership was a trap and she had been played for a fool. It could mean that Sutton was sending instructions to a man who had not agreed to anything, attempting to create a false record of prior agreement. It could mean something in between, something more complicated, some arrangement that Roscoe had been pressured into, or that he was being used as leverage in without his full knowledge. She thought about the way he had sat on her porch steps in July and said, those were the other reasons. She thought about what he had said in February in the cold corral, the calmness of it, the directness. She thought about 6 months of Tuesday and Thursday visits and careful work, and the way he looked at her when she was not looking back. She walked back to the telegraph station. "Clem," she said, "get me a fresh sheet of paper and your pen." "Ma'am, that telegram is addressed to Mr. Brenner and I don't think I should have." "I'm going to need you to trust me," Louise said, "and I will explain everything to you afterward. Fresh sheet, please." Clem, who had clearly decided that the path of least resistance was cooperation, produced the paper and the pen. Louise stood at the counter and she thought very carefully about what she was doing. Aldous Sutton had sent a telegram designed to dissolve her partnership with Roscoe Brenner and redirect Roscoe towards Sutton's own agenda, whatever that was. The telegram assumed a prior agreement that she did not know was real or fictional. If the telegram reached Roscoe as written, one of two things would happen. Either it would confirm an existing arrangement between Roscoe and Sutton, which would mean her entire strategy for the September hearing had been undermined, or it would confuse Roscoe, who might assume she knew about some Sutton agreement he had not told her about, which could create a rupture between them that Sutton was banking on. Either way, Sutton won. But if she rewrote it, she could buy time. She could force a conversation. She could find out the truth before everything fell apart. She wrote carefully and deliberately, mimicking the terse telegram style. To Roscoe, BRNNER stop, SUTTONTERMS, rejected stop Cooper partnership, stands and is binding stop prior agreement NULLIFIED by territorial law section 14 stop. Do not comply with any SUTTON instruction stop come to Cooper Ranch AT1 stop time is short stop all terms remain as agreed stop SIGNED ALDOUS SUTTON. She folded it and wrote Roscoe's name on the outside and set it on the counter. Clem stared at it. When Mr. Brenner comes to collect his telegram, Louise said, you give him that one. Ma'am, Clem, do you know what Aldous Sutton has been doing to the water that used to run through this county? Clem was quiet for a moment. My father's got a small operation east of town, he said slowly. Creek's been running low for 2 summers. Yes, Louise said. This is how we stop that. You give Mr. Brenner that telegram. She left the station and went directly to her horse and rode hard for Cooper Ranch, and she spent the whole ride home with her heart going fast and her mind going faster, trying to think through every possibility that might come next. She did not have to wait long. Roscoe arrived at Cooper Ranch the following morning, and when he rode into the yard, his expression was the most unreadable she had ever seen it. She was standing at the fence of the East Corral when he came in, and she watched him dismount with the controlled, deliberate movements of a man holding himself very carefully. He came to her and held up the telegram she had written. Tell me about Territorial Law Section 14, he said. There is no Territorial Law Section 14, Louise said. The silence stretched out between them. This isn't the original telegram, Roscoe said. It was not a question. No. He looked at her for a long moment. What did the original say? She told him exactly what it said, every word. She watched his face as she spoke, and she saw something move through it that was complex and layered and hard to read, and then it settled into something clearer. Prior agreement with Sutton Holdings, he said quietly. Louise, I need you to understand something. There is no prior agreement. There never was one. Sutton's man approached me in May with an offer, and I rejected it without negotiating terms. He's inventing an agreement that doesn't exist. She looked at him directly. You rejected it completely. Completely. The same day I received the letter, I wrote back and said that my commitments were already made, and I was not interested in any further correspondence. His dark eyes were intent on hers. I should have told you when it happened. I thought it was over and I didn't want to worry you with something that seemed settled. Why didn't you tell me last week? You've been distant. He paused, and she saw him weigh the honesty of the answer. Because 2 weeks ago Sutton's man came to my ranch again in person. He said things about the arrangement that were designed to make me doubt the situation. He implied that you were conducting separate negotiations with the bank that would change the nature of our partnership without telling me. I didn't believe him, but it planted something I was having trouble shaking. I was trying to work it out internally instead of asking you directly, which was wrong. What exactly did he say about me? That you had agreed to a conditional sale of the water rights to the bank as collateral, which would make our case at the hearing moot. That I was being used to drive up the apparent value of the land rights before a deal was concluded. He watched her face. I didn't believe it, but I should have asked you directly instead of carrying it alone. Louise felt the shape of Sutton's strategy become completely clear to her. He had inserted doubt between them. He had done it quietly and precisely, and then he had sent the telegram to deliver the killing stroke to a partnership he had already tried to weaken from within. It was, she had to admit, well constructed. I have not spoken to the bank about the water rights, she said. The terms of our partnership are exactly as they were in February. I have not made any separate arrangements with anyone." "I know that," he said. "I knew it. He stopped. I let him put something between us that had no business being there, and I'm sorry for it." The morning was already heating up, the sun climbing and the light going from gold to white, and they stood at the fence looking at each other with the particular intensity of two people who have just navigated something that could have destroyed them. "What do we do about the telegram?" Roscoe asked. "We go to the Territorial Land Office before Sutton does," Louise said. "We put our documentation in now ahead of schedule, and we request an expedited hearing. Sutton is moving because he's afraid of September. That means the case is stronger than we even knew." She watched something settle in his expression, the distraction burning away, replaced by the focused certainty that she had seen in him from the beginning. "There's something else," she said, because they were apparently doing honesty now. "When I read that telegram, the thing that hurt was not the threat to the ranch. I mean it was, but that wasn't the first thing." She looked at him with complete directness. "The first thing was the thought that you had agreed to it, that you had been working against me the whole time. And the reason that hurt more than the ranch is something I think you know already." He was very still. "After September," she said softly, "is suddenly feeling like a very long way away." He crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands and kissed her once, carefully, and with a completeness that said everything about the 6 months of careful, deliberate, patient restraint that had preceded it. His hands were warm and she could feel the steadiness in them. When they separated, she was breathing differently and the light seemed brighter. "We still have the hearing to win," he said, his voice slightly rough. "We do," she agreed, "so let's go win it." They rode for Carson City that same afternoon, not stopping for more than the horses needed, and the miles went by in a particular kind of charged silence that was nothing like the uncomfortable silences of the early months. This was a silence that contained everything they had just said and everything that was still to come, and Louise found it as comfortable as speech. They reached Carson City by evening and put the horses at the livery and took rooms at the Ormsby House, which was the best hotel in the territorial capital, and which they could not quite afford but which Roscoe insisted on because, he said, "You do not make a case for your legal rights while staying in a place that suggests you do not have resources to defend them." In the morning, they went to the Territorial Land Office before it opened, and were the first through the door when the clerk arrived. They requested the expedited hearing. The clerk, a careful man named Morrison who wore steel-rimmed spectacles, looked through their documentation with the unreadable expression of someone who processes many such requests and is professionally committed to revealing nothing. He excused himself for 20 minutes and returned with a supervisor, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Dahl, who turned out to be considerably more useful than anyone Louise had encountered in her 2 years of navigating territorial bureaucracy. Mrs. Dahl sat down with them, read the prior appropriation documentation, looked at the original survey, and read Roscoe's legal brief. Then she looked at both of them over her own glasses. "This is in order," she said. "And you've established prior appropriation as of 1868, which supersedes Sutton's filing by 11 years. She paused. "Why are you requesting expedited status?" "Because Aldous Sutton of Denver sent a fraudulent telegram 2 days ago claiming a prior agreement with our partner," Louise said. "He's moving against us and we need to be ahead of him." Mrs. Dahl looked at them for a long moment. "The hearing will be in 2 weeks, September 5th. Louise felt something release in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time. They left the land office and stood on the steps in the Carson City morning, and Roscoe looked at her with a quiet, complete satisfaction that she felt reflected in herself. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks. We should stay another day and make sure the documentation is fully in order. There are 3 filings I want to cross-reference with the original survey." "Yes," he said. "And after that we should have dinner somewhere that is not a trail camp, because I have been wanting to take you to dinner properly since approximately March, and it has not been possible." She laughed, and the sound of it rose into the Nevada morning air and dissipated like smoke. The dinner was at a restaurant near the Capitol building, and it was the first time since February that they sat across from each other with nothing pressing to discuss, no document to review, no strategy to plan. It was a different kind of conversation, exploratory in a way that their earlier talks had not had room to be. He told her about Texas, about growing up in Comfort, which was a small German settlement in the hill country, and about his father who had been a farmer and his mother who had come from a family of teachers and who had put books in his hands before he was old enough to find trouble. He told her about leaving at 22 with the specific restlessness of someone who knew the shape of the place they were in too well, and about the water rights case in Texas, which had taken 18 months and more stubbornness than he had known he possessed. She told him about her father, about the way he had talked to her like a business partner from the time she was 12, walking her through the ranch accounts and the range decisions and the breeding records, treating her knowledge as a resource rather than a curiosity. About the 2 years of managing everything alone and the way the loneliness of it had settled into her so gradually that she had almost not noticed it was there until one evening in July when she had sat on the porch steps and a man had sat below her on the steps and said, "I know," and she had felt the loneliness shift. "My father told me once," she said, over the coffee that came after the meal, that the ranch was not the point. That all the work, the land and the cattle and the water, was the infrastructure of a life, not the life itself. He said that when you have only the infrastructure you have something worth maintaining, but when you have the life inside it too, you have something worth fighting for. Roscoe looked at her across the table with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was saying something more than the words. What did he mean by the life inside it, he asked. People, she said. I think he meant people. She looked at him steadily. I think he meant that doing this alone was always temporary. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything else about it because nothing else needed to be said. They rode back to Harlan Creek the following morning, and the days that separated them from September 5th were the fullest days she had lived in years, because something had been allowed to be real that had spent 6 months being carefully managed, and the release of that management felt like removing a weight she had grown so accustomed to that she had forgotten it was there. He came every day now, not just Tuesdays and Thursdays. He would come in the morning and they would work on the case until afternoon, and then he would stay for the cooler part of the day, sometimes working with Gil on fence repairs or riding the eastern pasture with her to check the creek levels. And in the evenings they would sit on the porch and talk until the sky was fully dark. Gil Stokes, who was 63 and had been with the Cooper family for 20 years and who missed very little, said nothing to Louise directly, but began leaving the porch lamp lit in the evenings without being asked, which was his own form of approval. Sutton was not idle in those 2 weeks. He sent a representative to the Territorial Land Office to file objections to the expedited timeline, which Mrs. Dahl denied. He sent a letter to Louise that was carefully worded and significantly less pleasant than his personal visit had been, suggesting that she reconsider her position before the hearing and reminding her of the bank debt. She filed it in the stove without responding. He also, she learned secondhand through the Harlan Creek post office, sent a corrected telegram to Roscoe, presumably the same message or close to it that he had sent before. Roscoe told her about it with the flat, unemotional calm of someone filing information. "What did you do with it?" she asked. Wrote back and said I had no prior agreement with Sutton Holdings and that any claim otherwise was false, and that my partnership with Cooper Ranch was legally binding and in effect. He paused. I also mentioned that my attorney, by which I meant myself, was available to discuss the matter in the context of the September 5th hearing. Louise looked at him with the precise expression she wore when she was both amused and deeply appreciative. You're your own attorney. I passed the bar examination in Texas in 1877. I never practiced formally, but the qualifications are valid in Nevada territory. He watched her absorb this. I should have mentioned that in February. Yes, she said with considerable understatement. You probably should have. September 5th arrived and Louise put on the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool that had belonged to her mother and that she had kept carefully through everything. And she braided her dark hair and pinned it up and looked at herself in the square mirror above her washstand and said quietly to no one in particular, "Father, I hope you're watching." The territorial hearing was held in a spare government room in Carson City that smelled of paper and dust, and the particular institutional gravity of decisions that have consequences. There were 5 people on the hearing panel, including Mrs. Dahl, who was one of the more senior members and whose presence made Louise feel fractionally better. Aldous Sutton was there with 2 attorneys and his silent, satchel-carrying assistant. He wore his gray suit and his silver watch chain and his pleasant expression that she had learned to read as a form of performance. He nodded to her when she entered, which she acknowledged with the minimal possible courtesy. Roscoe presented their case. He was not theatrical about it, which she had expected. He laid the documents in order, walked through the prior appropriation timeline, established the 1868 filing and the survey record, and then presented a careful, methodical argument for why Louise Cooper's water rights to the eastern tributary predated Sutton Holdings' claims by 11 years and were therefore legally superior under Nevada territorial law. Sutton's attorneys argued that prior appropriation required continuous and beneficial use, and that there had been periods in the Cooper Ranch history when the eastern tributary usage had lapsed. Roscoe had anticipated this argument completely. He had gone through her father's ranch records and assembled documentation of consistent usage going back to 1869, including irrigation records and cattle watering logs that Louise had not even known existed until he found them in the bottom of her father's office chest. The hearing took 3 hours. At the end of it, the panel withdrew for 40 minutes, and Louise sat in the corridor outside with Roscoe beside her and her hands folded in her lap and her spine perfectly straight, and she did not allow herself to think about what happened if they lost. When the panel returned, Mrs. Dahl read the ruling. Prior appropriation rights to the eastern tributary of the Harlan Creek watershed were confirmed in favor of Cooper Ranch and its owner Louise Cooper, predating any claim by Sutton Holdings by 11 years. Sutton Holdings was directed to cease and desist from any diversion or obstruction of the northern tributary that reduced water flow to properties holding prior appropriation rights. A compliance schedule was established. Louise sat very still for a moment after the ruling was read. Then she pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling and let out one slow, controlled breath. Roscoe's hand found hers under the table. She held it very tightly for one moment, and then she was composed again and they were standing and Sutton was across the room with an expression that had finally lost its pleasantness. And Louise looked at him once, steadily, with no triumph and no cruelty, just the simple, clear acknowledgement of one person to another that the game was over and she had won it. Sutton left without speaking to either of them. They rode back to Harlan Creek in the afternoon light, with the hearing behind them and the water rights ahead of them, and everything different from what it had been that morning. The miles went by and Louise felt the accumulated weight of 2 years of fighting begin to release, not all at once but in layers like a gradual thaw. Halfway back, Roscoe said, "The grazing rights on the southern 40 expire at the end of next year." "Yes," she said, "I'll need to renegotiate something." She looked over at him on his roan horse, the light going golden and western around them. "What kind of renegotiation did you have in mind?" "Something more permanent," he said. "Something with better terms for both parties." She felt the warmth of that move through her the same way it had on the porch steps in July. "I imagine," she said carefully, "that such terms would need to be discussed in detail." "Extensively," he agreed. They rode on in the golden light and said nothing more about it for the rest of the journey, because some negotiations were better conducted when you were not on horseback in the Nevada evening, and they had both learned to be patient with things that mattered. The weeks that followed the hearing were the first weeks in 2 years that Louise woke up each morning without the ranch's survival as the immediate first thought. The water situation began to improve as Sutton Holdings, faced with the binding ruling and the territorial compliance officers who came to ensure it was followed, gradually ceased the diversions. By October, the northern tributary was running at its pre-Sutton volume, and the eastern pastures were greening up in the way they had not since her father's time. She paid the bank on schedule, which gave her a satisfaction that was both practical and deeply personal. The debt had been the sword hanging over the ranch's future for 2 years, and making that payment from the proceeds of the first good fall grazing was something she recorded in the ranch ledger with a hand that was steady. Roscoe was there for the afternoon when she made the payment, and afterward they sat on the porch in the October warmth, which was gentle now rather than brutal, and she showed him the ledger entry. He looked at it and said very simply, "Your father would be proud." She nodded because she could not quite speak around the feeling that produced. He reached into his jacket and took out a small box and set it on the porch rail between them. She looked at the box for a moment and then at him. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the renegotiation I mentioned. I remember. I have 30 acres of my own, good ground, well watered, with a house that needs work but has a sound foundation, and a share of the eastern tributary easement that is now legally secured." He looked at her steadily. "Those are my practical assets. My other assets are somewhat less tangible, but I believe equally relevant to the terms under discussion." "What are the other assets?" she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. 6 months of Tuesday and Thursday visits that became something I did not anticipate in February. The fact that I have not once in 6 months wanted to be anywhere other than wherever you were. The fact that when I read that fraudulent telegram Sutton sent and realized what he was trying to do to us, the thing I was most afraid of was not the legal consequences but losing you. He paused. "And the fact that this is the most straightforward and least sentimental declaration I'm capable of, which is apparently still fairly sentimental." She laughed, and the evening air around them felt charged with the kind of warmth that is not about temperature. "Open the box," he said. She opened it. Inside was a ring, simple and well made, a band of gold with a small turquoise stone set in it. The turquoise was the particular deep blue-green of the Nevada sky in early morning, and she held it up in the fading light, and something about the color of it was exactly right. "Louise Cooper," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not phrased as a question, which she noted, but it felt right somehow that a man who had presented a legal brief on her behalf would state this as a declarative proposition. She was also aware that she was smiling in a way that she had no interest in containing. "Roscoe Brenner," she said. "Yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it against the weathered wood of the porch rail, and it was absolutely the right color and the right weight and the right fit. He kissed her then, with the same quiet completeness as the first time, and the October evening settled around them warmly. Gil Stokes came around the corner of the house with a bucket and stopped when he saw them, and the expression on his face was the particularly gratified expression of someone who has been waiting for something to happen for quite some time. "Well," he said, and turned around and went back the way he came, and they could hear him whistling as he crossed the yard. They were married in November, in the small church in Harlan Creek that had been established 3 years prior by the Methodist congregation, which was the denomination that had gotten there first. The minister was a young man from Ohio who took his work seriously and conducted the ceremony with appropriate gravity and occasional genuine warmth. Louise wore her mother's dress, which had been made for a woman of similar build, and she had let her dark hair down and pinned it back simply with a tortoiseshell comb that had been her grandmother's. She carried a small bunch of desert wildflowers that had no business blooming in November, but had apparently not been informed of this. Roscoe wore his good suit, the dark one he usually reserved for legal proceedings, and a string tie, and he stood at the front of the church with the particular stillness of a man who is exactly where he has decided to be. Gil stood as witness on Louise's side, which she had wanted. Roscoe's witness was a friend from his Texas days named Porter Waits, who had come up from Reno, where he had been working on a railroad project. A big, jovial man who wept without embarrassment during the vows, and then immediately laughed at himself for doing so. The vows themselves were the traditional ones, and Louise said them with her eyes on Roscoe's and the familiar particular attention of someone noting and recording every detail. The reception was held in the church hall, and half of Harlan Creek came because there had been very little celebration in the town recently, and people were hungry for it. The water ruling had benefited several smaller operations in the area beyond Cooper Ranch, and there was a general warmth toward Louise and Roscoe that expressed itself in the form of enthusiastic attendance and an extraordinary quantity of food that people had brought, as though the entire town had decided to make it a point of honor not to let anyone go hungry at this particular celebration. Clem from the telegraph station appeared near the end of the evening and shook Louise's hand and said, with a seriousness that made her fond of him, "I'm glad it worked out, ma'am, and I never told anyone about the telegram." "Thank you, Clem," she said. "How is your father's operation doing?" "Creek's running good again," he said. "First time in 2 summers. He says he doesn't know who to thank. Tell him the credit goes to prior appropriation law and a thorough filing system," she said, which made Clem blink and then smile. Roscoe, who had overheard this, came to stand beside her as Clem moved away and said quietly, "You're going to be a difficult person to surprise with a compliment." "I prefer the accurate version," she said. "I know. That's one of the things he paused, rearranged the sentence, "am most fond of about you." She looked up at him. "One of the things, among many." "Name them," she said. "Tonight. We have time." He looked at her with the quiet, dark-eyed warmth that she had been watching build over 9 months, and that now had nowhere to contain itself. "We have more than that," he said. "We have all the time there is." They sold Roscoe's property north of Harlan Creek in early December and used the proceeds to pay off the last of the bank debt, which Louise viewed as the final removal of the sword from above her head. The combined assets of the 2 operations were consolidated under Cooper Ranch, which was the name they kept for historical reasons, and because it was the name her father had given the land. The house at Cooper Ranch was large enough for 2, and with work could be made more so, and Roscoe spent the winter doing much of that work himself, with help from Gil and the hands and occasionally Porter Waits, who had decided to extend his stay in Nevada indefinitely, and seemed to have no strong feelings about where he spent his labor. The winter was cold and good. There was snow in January, real snow that lay across the basin and the mountains and made everything quiet. Louise found the winter different from the 2 winters she had survived alone, because when you came in from the cold to a house with a fire already built, and a person who was glad you were in from the cold, the winter was a completely different proposition. They worked the ranch through the winter months, planning for the spring, making decisions about the herd and the pastures and what to plant along the eastern tributary banks to stabilize them. These conversations had the same quality as their early case-building conversations, but without the underlying weight of crisis, and she found that making plans from a position of stability was an entirely different experience from making plans from a position of desperation. She wrote to her mother's sister in Ohio in January, describing the marriage and the resolution of the water dispute, and received a letter back in March that was generous and warm, and that ended with a postscript noting that Louise's mother, who had died when Louise was 8, had always said that the right man would be the one who helped her rather than the one who sought to manage her. Louise read this postscript aloud to Roscoe over the supper table, and he listened with the expression he wore for information he intended to keep. "Your mother sounds like she was an intelligent woman," he said. "She was, from everything I understand," Louise said. "I don't remember her as well as I'd like, but my father spoke of her often enough that I feel I know her in outline." "She was right," Roscoe said simply. The spring of 1883 came on early and warm, and the eastern tributary ran full and clear, and the southern pastures greened up in a way that Gil said he had not seen since the late 1870s. The cattle that had survived the hard summers were healthy and breeding well, and the new calves in the spring were strong. Louise sat on the top rail of the East Corral fence one morning in April watching the calves in the early light, and Roscoe came and stood beside her and handed her a cup of coffee. "I need to tell you something," she said. He leaned against the fence beside her and looked at the calves. "All right," she told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at her with an expression that was not entirely composed, which was unusual for him. "When?" he asked. "October, I think, or November." He set his coffee cup on the fence post and took her hand, and they stood in the April morning light with the calves moving in the pasture and the creek audible in the background, and the sky coming up blue and enormous over the mountains. "Your father told you the ranch was the infrastructure of a life," he said, "not the life itself." He did. He was right about that too. The summer of 1883 was kind, which was not always guaranteed in Nevada territory, but which Louise chose to accept as her due after the brutal summers that had preceded it. The water flowed as it should. The herd grew. The ranch ran with a smoothness that had the particular satisfaction of a system functioning as designed. Aldous Sutton did not trouble them again, which was partly because the legal ruling made interference costly and partly, Louise suspected, because Sutton was a practical man who recognized when a campaign had failed and directed his energy elsewhere. She heard occasionally through territorial business channels that he was involved in mining investments in Colorado, which suited her perfectly well. The Territorial Land Office had actually commended Roscoe's brief in a notation that was filed with the case record, and Mrs. Dahl sent a personal letter in the spring saying that the case had been referenced in discussions about water rights methodology, which Roscoe received with characteristic understatement, and then quietly filed in the office he had set up in the east room of the house. Porter Waits eventually secured himself a position with a land surveying company operating out of Reno, which was not so far that he could not appear at Cooper Ranch at irregular intervals with his large, cheerful presence, and his willingness to assist with whatever needed assisting. He and Gil Stokes developed an unlikely but evidently functional friendship based on a shared fondness for checkers and a shared low opinion of a particular cattle buyer who had cheated both of them at various points in their respective careers. Louise's son was born in October of 1883, which was exactly what she had told Roscoe to expect. He was born on a Tuesday, which pleased her because Tuesdays had always meant Roscoe, and he was healthy and loud and possessed, from his first day, of a pair of dark eyes that were so clearly his father's that Gil Stokes pointed to them within the first hour and said, "Well, there's no question about the inheritance." They named him Daniel Roscoe Brenner, which was the obvious choice, and which she suspected her father would have considered too sentimental and then secretly been delighted by. Roscoe was not a man who expressed himself loudly, but he held his son in the first hour of his life with a careful, complete attention that Louise watched from the bed with the specific exhaustion and fierce satisfaction of a woman who has just done something extraordinary, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. He looked up and found her watching him and said, "He's real." "Yes," she said. "I wasn't sure that was going to be the case until right now." He looked back at the small, dark-eyed, dramatically unhappy person in his arms. "Hello, Daniel," he said quietly. Daniel did not appear to be appeased by the greeting but gradually quieted anyway, possibly reassured by the steadiness of the hands holding him. The winter of 1883 was the warmest and most complete winter Louise had ever known, which she attributed partly to the weather and mostly to having a house that was full in a way it had not been before. Daniel was a demanding and energetic baby who did not sleep through the night for the first 4 months of his life, and who developed opinions about most things before he had the vocabulary to express them, which led to a great deal of emphatic and gesturally complex communication that his father found genuinely fascinating, and his mother found alternately amusing and maddening. Roscoe, she discovered, was an extraordinarily patient father, which should not have surprised her given the evidence of his general character, but which delighted her nonetheless. He would sit with Daniel for long periods in the evenings, talking to him in the quiet, attentive way that he brought to everything, and Daniel appeared to find this deeply satisfying, regarding his father with the concentrated, slightly myopic attention of someone taking notes for later use. Gil turned 64 in the spring and announced that his knees would not permit him another full year of active ranch work, which they both recognized, and which led to an arrangement where Gil took on a supervisory and advisory role, training the 2 new hands they brought on in the spring, and was provided with a smaller cabin on the property with his own stove and a generous wage that acknowledged 20+ years of loyalty. He declared this arrangement acceptable and then went immediately to tell Porter Waits about it, which was apparently a significant event because Porter appeared at the ranch 2 days later with a gift of good whiskey for Gil and a hand-carved toy for Daniel that was meant to be a horse, but had an impressionistic quality that made identification somewhat speculative. In the spring of 1884, Louise and Roscoe stood together at the fence of the east pasture and watched the creek run full and clear across the bottom of the property, and she thought about February of 1882 and the cold corral and the man who had said, "You look like someone with a problem." "What are you thinking?" Roscoe asked. "About the beginning," she said, "about how close it all came to not happening." "Which part?" "All of it, the water rights, the telegram, the hearing." She watched the water moving. "If I had not been at the station that day, if Clem had not called out to me, if I had decided the practical thing was to let the telegram reach you and ask you about it afterward. You intercepted a telegram, rewrote it, and handed it to a telegraph operator with a 2-sentence explanation of the history of water rights disputes," Roscoe said. "This surprises me not at all." She smiled at the creek. "Clem told me last month that he still has the original telegram, kept it as a record. He says he intends to give it to Daniel someday as a piece of family history. That's a better historical record than most families have. He also told me he's been studying water law and the territorial statutes in his spare time. He wants to become a land agent." Roscoe looked at her. "We may have created something." "Possibly." She felt the warmth of the spring sun on her shoulders and the warmth of his presence beside her, and Daniel's small, energetic protest from inside the house where his grandmother's sister, who had come to visit from Ohio, and had stayed rather longer than planned because she had found Nevada unexpectedly agreeable, was presumably managing something. The protest subsided, which suggested it had been managed. "Roscoe," she said, "Louise, are you happy?" He considered this with the deliberateness he brought to all real questions, and she waited because she knew the wait would produce an honest answer. "Yes," he said, "specifically and completely, more than I would have thought possible before February of 1882. He looked at her with the dark, steady eyes that she knew as well as she knew the view from her own porch. "Are you?" She looked at Cooper Ranch, at the water running through the eastern pasture, at the solid walls of the house her father had built, at everything that had been nearly lost and was now more than it had ever been. "I am," she said, and she meant it in the fullest way that words could carry meaning, which was not completely but was enough. He put his arm around her shoulders and they stood at the fence in the spring morning, and the water ran clear over the stones of the eastern tributary of the Harlan Creek watershed, prior appropriation rights confirmed and legally binding, as it should always have been. The summer came on, and the ranch moved through it with the rhythm of a settled and well-run operation. Louise managed the accounts and the herd decisions, and the grazing rotation that Roscoe had helped her redesign in the spring to take better advantage of the restored water flow. Roscoe spent increasing amounts of time consulting on land and water disputes for other small operations in the territory, which he did from the east room of the house and occasionally from Carson City, and which brought in a steady supplemental income that was not necessary but was useful. His reputation from the Cooper Ranch case had apparently spread through the territorial land office and among the smaller ranching and farming communities, and there was no shortage of people who had problems that the careful application of water law and prior appropriation documentation might solve. Louise supported this work entirely because it was exactly the right use of what he was good at, and because she had a particular feeling about the importance of someone being willing to use their skills in the service of people who were being squeezed by those with more resources. She had been one of those people, and she had not forgotten it. Clem, at the telegraph station, began his land agent studies. He came to Roscoe twice that summer with questions, and Roscoe sat with him for a total of several hours explaining the mechanisms of prior appropriation and beneficial use, and the specific statutes that governed water rights in Nevada Territory. Clem took notes with the same focused attention he brought to his telegraph work and asked careful, intelligent questions. And by the end of the second session, Roscoe told Louise that the young man would make a good land agent if he persisted. He persisted. He eventually obtained his certification 2 years later and opened a small practice in Harlan Creek that served the community well for many years, and that had a particular specialty, as it happened, in water rights disputes. Whether this was entirely attributable to the afternoon Louise Cooper handed him back a rewritten telegram and said, "Trust me," or whether it was something that would have found its way out of him regardless, was a question Clem himself would have found interesting to speculate on. The autumn of 1884 brought the first full harvest from the expanded pastures, and the numbers in the ledger were the best Louise had recorded since before her father's death. She sat at the desk in the evening after Daniel was in bed, going through the accounts with the oil lamp throwing its circle of light over the pages, and she ran the final column and looked at the total, and she permitted herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. Roscoe came in from the east room, where he had been working on a brief for a small farming operation in the next county, and sat across from her and looked at her face. "Good numbers," he said. "The best in 4 years." He nodded, and there was in the nod the particular acknowledgement of a man who remembers exactly what it took to get from there to here. "I want to hire another hand in the spring," Louise said. "For the southern pastures. The herd can expand if we manage the rotation right, and the water supports it now." "Agreed. And we need to re-roof the hay barn before winter." They went on like this for a while, the comfortable, pragmatic planning of 2 people running a shared enterprise, and then he got up and came around the desk and kissed the top of her head, which was something he did at the end of working days, and which she always noticed and never said anything about, because some things were better kept as they were. She reached up and briefly took his hand as he passed. Daniel walked at 11 months and was running, in the approximate sense of the word, by 13 months, which kept everyone at Cooper Ranch in a state of managed alertness for some time. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's dark hair, and what appeared to be both of their stubbornnesses in a combined and concentrated form that suggested he would be deeply interesting and also deeply challenging for the foreseeable future. He said his first word at 10 months, which was water, which Louise found both apt and slightly uncanny. His second word was horse. His third word was no, used comprehensively and with great confidence. By the time he was 2, he was following his father around the ranch with the intense purposefulness of a very small person who has decided exactly where he is meant to be and has no time for alternatives. Roscoe accommodated this with his characteristic patience, explaining things to Daniel in ordinary language as he worked, and Daniel listened with his father's attentive stillness, absorbing more than was perhaps obvious. Porter Waits, who came by with reliable irregularity, declared Daniel to be the most opinionated 2-year-old he had ever encountered, and that this was clearly a distinction and should be celebrated, and brought him a better horse carving that was recognizably equine in a way the first one had not been. Louise's aunt from Ohio, who had remained through the summer and then written to her husband requesting that she stay through the winter on the grounds that Louise needed assistance with Daniel, and who had received what was apparently a very understanding response, was a woman named Beatrice who had no children of her own, and who had clearly been waiting for decades to apply the considerable energy she had been directing elsewhere toward the raising of a small person. She and Daniel reached an accommodation within the first 2 weeks that was based on mutual respect and a shared interest in the natural world, and they could frequently be found examining rocks and insects and the creek bank in a manner that was educational for Daniel and visibly delightful for Beatrice. When Beatrice finally returned to Ohio in the spring of 1885, there were tears on both sides, and Daniel, who was by then old enough to miss someone, was quiet for 3 days, which for Daniel was an extraordinary departure from his usual state. Louise wrote to Beatrice regularly after that, and Beatrice wrote back, and the correspondence was one of the good things of those years. The spring of 1885 brought the new hand they had planned for, a young man of 22 named Elias who had come west from Missouri, and who proved to be steady and competent, and who got along well with Gil in the way that some young men get along well with older ones, when there is something genuine to learn from each other. The summer of 1885 was the first summer in which Louise woke in the morning without any specific crisis requiring immediate management, which was a novel experience and one she found she had to adjust to. The ranch was running well. The legal situation was settled. The accounts were strong. The family was growing in the particular way that families grow when they are healthy, not dramatically or with fanfare, but with the steady accumulation of small days that add up to something substantial. She was aware, on an ordinary Tuesday in June, that she was happy, specifically and completely, in exactly the way Roscoe had described it the previous spring. She was standing at the east fence in the early morning with a cup of coffee and the creek running and Daniel's voice audible from inside the house, raised in his characteristic advocacy for something that was presumably breakfast-related, and the sky was the deep pre-sunrise blue that she had always found the most beautiful thing about Nevada, and she was aware of the happiness as a fact, precise and unqualified. She held it carefully, the way you hold something you know has weight. Roscoe came out with his own coffee and stood beside her and looked at the same sky. "Telegram from Carson City," he said. "The Holt family in Washoe County. They have a water dispute with a mining operation. Similar patterns to ours. You'll take it." "I think so. It's a strong case if the documentation holds." He looked at the sky. "I'll need to be in Carson City for 3 days next week." "I know." She leaned briefly against his shoulder. "We'll manage." "I know you will." He looked down at her. That was never in question. She smiled at the creek in the morning. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her. "November again, or December?" The sky was going from blue to gold, and his expression was doing something that she found, even now, completely disarming. "Daniel is going to be," he began, "a force of nature regardless," she said. "This will be character building for him." He laughed, and the sound of it rose into the Nevada morning the same way hers had the previous year, and the sky continued to go from gold to the particular warm white of a Nevada summer morning. Their daughter was born in November of 1885, and they named her Martha, which had been Roscoe's mother's name, and she was from her first day a person of serene and absolute certainty, which was in such complete contrast to her brother's unceasing advocacy that the household adjusted to the difference within the first week with something like relief. Daniel regarded Martha with a 2-year-old's comprehensive and sometimes overwhelming interest, and had to be explained several times that she was not currently able to do most of the things he wanted her to do, including ride horses, which he had already decided she would need to learn. He appeared to file this information under temporary impediments and regarded her with patient expectation. Roscoe won the Holt family case in Washoe County, which took 6 months rather than 3, but which resulted in a ruling that was directly influenced by the precedent established by the Cooper Ranch case of 1882. This made 2 significant water rights rulings in 3 years that had protected small operations against the kind of resource appropriation that had nearly destroyed Cooper Ranch. And the Territorial Land Office noted the second case in its annual report with language that was as close to enthusiastic as a government document generally manages. Louise read the annual report because Roscoe brought her a copy, and because she found it genuinely interesting, which was one of the things about her that he had decided early on was remarkable and had never changed his mind about. They built an addition to the east side of the house in the spring of 1886, because with Martha's arrival, the available space had been reorganized beyond its comfortable capacity, and because Gil was getting older and his cabin, which was warm enough, was perhaps not as close to the main house as it should be for a man of 67 whose knees were the ongoing subject of complaint. The addition included a larger room for the children and an expanded office space for Roscoe and a door connecting to Gil's new quarters, and the whole project was completed by June in time for the summer. Gil's 67th birthday was observed with more ceremony than he would have chosen, because Elias and Porter Waits, who had by some process Louise did not entirely follow been appointed joint organizers of this event, had decided that someone who had worked on the Cooper Ranch for more than 20 years deserved a significant acknowledgement, and they were not wrong about that. They produced a dinner of considerable ambition, and Clem came from town and Roscoe made a speech that was brief and specific and exactly right. And Gil was embarrassed and clearly moved, and told everyone they had gone completely overboard in a tone that indicated he was deeply grateful. Louise, watching this from the porch steps where she was holding Martha and keeping an eye on Daniel, who was 3.5 and at a stage where attending an outdoor event without immediate supervision was an optimistic proposition, felt the fullness of it like a kind of completion. All the people in that yard were there because of choices made in cold corrals and telegraph stations and government hearing rooms, and the choices had been made from necessity and from stubbornness, and from something that she now understood was the clearest form of hope, which is the kind that does not require certainty to be operational. She looked at the creek in the evening light, running clear and full along the eastern pasture. She looked at her husband, who was laughing at something Porter had said, and who looked up and found her watching him and held her gaze for a moment with all the particular warmth of someone who knows exactly where they are. She looked at Martha in her arms, serene and wide-eyed, and at Daniel, who had somehow acquired a piece of cake and was addressing it with the focused application of someone completing important work. She thought about her father. About the February morning she had ridden 30 miles in the cold to a stranger's corral because she had run out of options, and because she had decided, without knowing what she was deciding, that she was not done fighting. About the telegram she had rewritten, and the legal case she had won, and the ring with the turquoise stone that she still wore on her left hand, and that still caught the light in the early morning in a way that she had never quite gotten used to. She thought about the injustice of the water, and the way it had been used as a weapon against smaller operations by people with resources enough to redirect the natural world to their own advantage. She thought about Clem, studying water law in the evenings. She thought about the Holt family in Washoe County, whose creek now ran as it should. She thought about all the unnamed people downstream who had simply found their water improved without knowing why. Small actions in telegraph stations, legal briefs built from ranch records and sleepless nights and stubbornness, Two people in a cold corral deciding to trust each other with something that mattered. The evening deepened and the stars came up over Nevada territory, and Cooper Ranch settled into the quiet of a good summer night, and Louise Cooper Brenner stayed on the porch steps a little longer than she needed to, just to feel all of it completely. Roscoe came and sat beside her when the gathering had begun to wind down, and they watched the stars for a while with Martha sleeping between them. "I've been thinking," he said, "about. The cases are getting more complex. There are operations throughout the territory dealing with similar issues. What you did, what we did, the documentation, the legal mechanism, it could be formalized in some way. A guide for ranchers and farmers on establishing and defending water rights." She looked at him. "You want to write it? I think we should write it. You understand the practical side of it in a way I don't, having lived it from the position you were in." She thought about this for a moment. A practical guide to prior appropriation and water rights for Nevada territory. "Yes, that," she said, "is an excellent idea." He looked satisfied in the spare, particular way that she had come to know was his version of enthusiasm. "We could dedicate it to Daniel Cooper," she said. "My father. He filed the first claim. That's the right dedication." Daniel, who had finished his cake and located a frog near the porch steps and was conducting a detailed examination of it by lantern light, looked up at the mention of his name and said, "What?" "Nothing to do with you," Louise said. He considered this, deemed it acceptable, and returned to the frog. They wrote the guide through the following winter, working in the evenings at the desk in the East Room while the children slept, and it was one of the better projects of their lives. Not the largest or the most urgent, but one that had a particular satisfaction to it, because it would be useful in the specific, lasting way that documentation and legal clarity are useful to people who do not have lawyers on retainer, and who need to understand their rights without having to learn them through crisis. The guide was printed in Carson City in the spring of 1887 by a print shop that also produced the territorial newspaper, and 50 copies were distributed to land offices and county seats throughout Nevada territory, and the dedication on the inside of the front cover read, "In memory of Daniel Cooper, who filed the claim, and for everyone who needs to know that the water you have always used is the water you are entitled to." Clem received a copy and told Louise, with the earnest seriousness that was his consistent mode, that he had already recommended it to 3 of his clients, and that he intended to make it required reading for anyone who came to him with a water dispute. Louise thanked him and thought about the telegraph station in August of 1882 and the pen in her hand and the fresh sheet of paper, and how the smallest redirections, applied at the exact right moment, can change the course of everything downstream. The creek ran clear on the eastern pasture of Cooper Ranch in the spring of 1887, as it had the spring before and would the spring after. Martha was learning to walk, steadily and with characteristic composure, each step taken with the careful assessment of someone who is not going to fall if she can help it. Daniel was 4.5 and had developed a serious interest in horses that had moved well past general enthusiasm into something that looked like a genuine vocation, and Roscoe had begun teaching him in the patient, attentive way he brought to everything worth teaching. Louise stood at the east fence one April morning in the full light of a season that had come in properly, and the water ran clear over the stones, and the mountains stood against the sky in the way they always had, and she held her coffee and looked at everything that had been saved, and everything that had been built, and everything that was still becoming, and she was the kind of content that does not need anything added to it to be sufficient. Roscoe came and stood beside her, and she gave him half of her attention and kept the other half on the morning, and he did the same thing, which was one of the best things about them together, that they had learned to share silence the way you share something good. "Your father was right," he said after a while. She looked at him. "The ranch is the infrastructure. This is the life." He looked at her steadily with his dark eyes. "I wanted you to know that I know the difference." She looked back at the creek and the mountains and the sky. "I know you do," she said, That's why it works. And it did work, and it would go on working, season into season, with all the difficulty and all the grace of a thing that has been built carefully and tended well, and is made of the right materials. Two people who had chosen each other with their eyes open, over a forged telegram and a cold corral and 6 months of careful restraint and a turquoise ring the color of the Nevada morning sky. The creek ran. The ranch held. Cooper Ranch, prior appropriation rights confirmed and legally binding, stood in the Nevada basin as it had stood since Daniel Cooper first broke ground, and would stand long after, its water rights documented and defended and passed forward to children who would grow up knowing that the water they had always used was the water they were entitled to. And Louise Cooper Brenner, who had rewritten the terms of a telegram, and in doing so rewritten the terms of everything, stood at the east fence in the April morning with her coffee and her husband and her children's voices drifting out from the house behind her, and she was exactly where she had decided to be, which is the only place that counts.